Tell me in the comments from where you are watching and show support by subscribing the channel and liking the video. The story of Genghis Khan begins not with a conqueror, but with a boy named Temüjin, born into a world as harsh and unforgiving as the man he would become. Around the year 1162, somewhere near the Anan River in what is now northeastern Mongolia, Temüjin came into a land of boundless grasslands, bitter winters, and a sky that stretched so wide it could swallow a man whole. His people, the Genghis clan of the Mongols, lived on the edge of survival, moving with their herds across the steppe, following the rhythms of pasture and water. The Mongol world of the 12th century was not a unified nation but a fractured patchwork of clans and tribes, each fiercely loyal to their own kin and constantly at war over grazing land, trade routes, and ancient grudges. In this arena of shifting alliances and sudden betrayals, a man's power could vanish as quickly as the snow under the first warmth of spring. Temüjin's father, Yasuge, was a respected tribal chieftain, though not among the most powerful. He commanded loyalty from his warriors through courage and cunning, and his marriage to Holan had been an act of both passion and political calculation. Holan was originally betrothed to a man of the Merkit tribe, but Yasuge, following a tradition not uncommon on the steppe, seized her from her bridal escort and took her as his own wife. It was a practice known as bride capture, a custom that could forge alliances or ignite blood feuds. From this union came Temüjin, their firstborn son, whose name is thought to have been inspired by a Totor chieftain Yasuge had captured shortly before the boy's birth. In the culture of the steppe, such a name was not just a label, it carried the symbolic weight of victory, strength, and destiny. Temüjin's early life, though, was no romantic tale of noble lineage. From his earliest days, he lived under the constant tension of survival. As the son of a chieftain, he learned to ride a horse before most children in settled lands could walk steadily. The bow, the spear, and the knife were not toys but tools of life and death. He was trained to read the wind, to judge the distance of an approaching rider, to find water where none seemed to exist. The Mongol steppe was a school without walls and without mercy, and it taught its lessons through hunger, cold, and danger. Yet for all his father's guidance, the greatest shaping force in Temüjin's early years would come from tragedy. When Temüjin was about 9 years old, Yasuge arranged for him to be sent to the Onjurat tribe to live with his future wife's family. This was a common practice, a way to secure alliances through marriage. On his way back from this journey, Yasuge encountered a group of Tatars, an old enemy of his people. They welcomed him into their camp, offered him food and drink, but poisoned his meal in an act of treachery. He made it back to his family, alive but gravely ill, and within days, he was dead. For Temüjin, the loss of his father was more than a personal tragedy, it was a political catastrophe. Yasuge's position as chieftain was not hereditary. His authority depended on his ability to command loyalty through strength and generosity. Without him, the family's protection vanished. In the ruthless politics of the steppe, weakness was an invitation to predation. The Genghis clan, once loyal to Yasuge, abandoned his widow and children almost immediately. Stripped of their status, Temüjin Holan and his siblings were forced into exile, left to fend for themselves in a land where the winter could kill as surely as a sword. They became outcasts, surviving by foraging for roots, berries, and whatever small game they could catch. Holan, a woman of formidable strength and will, became the family's anchor. She taught her children to work together, to endure hunger and hardship, and to rely on each other when no one else could be trusted. But hardship soon deepened into humiliation. The Temüjin, a powerful rival tribe and traditional enemy of Temüjin's family, eventually captured the boy, taking him as a prisoner. Bound in a wooden kang, a heavy yoke that restricted his movement, Temüjin lived as a slave, performing menial labor and enduring the scorn of his captors. Yet even in captivity, his intelligence and determination set him apart. He forged a connection with one of his guards, who eventually helped him escape under cover of night, an act of loyalty Temüjin would never forget. This experience imprinted on him a deep understanding of both human cruelty and human loyalty, lessons that would form the bedrock of his future leadership. By the time Temüjin returned to his family, he was no longer a boy. The steppe had already begun to carve the steel into his character. He had known betrayal by kin, kindness from unexpected allies, and the bitter taste of powerlessness. Out of these early trials grew a conviction that the traditional bonds of clan and aristocracy were unreliable. Instead, he began to imagine a world where loyalty was earned through trust and ability, not inherited privilege. It was a vision that would eventually reshape not just the Mongol steppe, but much of the known world. Temüjin's childhood was a crucible, a relentless testing ground of hunger, loss, and danger. It stripped away illusions and left in their place a resilience that nothing could shake. He emerged from it with a clarity of purpose, rare for someone so young, to protect those who followed him, to punish betrayal, and to bind men together, not with the fragile thread of bloodline, but with the unbreakable steel of loyalty. From the windswept banks of the Annan River, a boy once abandoned and enslaved was taking his first steps on the long road to becoming the most formidable conqueror in history. The boy who had once been a prisoner in the camp of his enemies returned to the windswept steppes with more than just freedom. He returned with a vision. Temüjin understood now, with a clarity born of suffering, that survival on the Mongol steppe demanded more than a strong sword arm. Strength alone could be broken. A man needed loyal allies, men who would ride through snow and blood for him, not because they shared his blood, but because they shared his trust. In a land where clan loyalty shifted like desert sand, this was a radical thought, and Temüjin, barely a man, would begin to test it. One of the first and most important steps on this path came through marriage. As a boy, Temüjin had been betrothed to a girl named Bert of the Onjurat tribe, a match arranged by his father. Now, years later, Temüjin returned to the Onjurat to claim his bride. Bert was more than a wife. She was a political bridge to one of the most respected tribes on the steppe. Her father welcomed the union, and Temüjin left with not only a partner but also the goodwill of an influential ally. Bert would become one of the most steadfast figures in Temüjin's life, and her loyalty would soon be tested. Not long after their marriage, calamity struck again. The Merkit tribe, still nursing the old grudge from when Yasuge had abducted Holon years before, raided Temüjin's camp in the dead of night. In a swift and brutal assault, they captured Bert and rode away into the darkness. For this was not merely a personal attack, it was an open challenge to his authority and his honor. On the steppe, failing to reclaim a stolen wife could permanently stain a man's reputation. Temüjin knew he could not face the Merkits alone, so he turned to the growing web of alliances he had been quietly weaving. He called upon Togrul, Khan of the powerful Karat tribe and an old blood brother ally of his father, as well as Jamuka, a boyhood friend and fellow warrior who had once been like a brother to him. Together, their combined forces swept down upon the Merkits with devastating speed. Bert was rescued, and the Merkits were crushed, their warriors scattered to the winds. This campaign not only restored Temüjin's honor, but also demonstrated The power of strategic partnerships, a lesson he would carry forward into every campaign. Yet the alliance with Jamukha, so fruitful in the rescue of Bert, soon soured. Jamukha was charismatic and ambitious, and in the eyes of many Mongols, he had the better claim to leadership. The two men were bound together by years of shared hardship, yet divided by something deeper, a vision of what Mongol leadership should be. Jamukha clung to the traditions of the aristocratic elite, favoring noble birth over ability. Temüjin, forged in the fires of abandonment and captivity, believed loyalty and competence mattered more than lineage. This was not a small difference. It was a rift that would soon split the Mongol steppe. For a time, the two rode together, their combined strength intimidating rival clans. Temüjin's reputation grew as he rewarded merit and protected the families of those who followed him, even from among conquered tribes. This made him both respected and feared, for in breaking the old rules of aristocracy, he threatened the very structure of steppe politics. In the fragile balance of Mongol power, such a threat could not go unanswered. Eventually, the rivalry between Temüjin and Jamukha erupted into open war. Their first great battle was fought on the banks of the Anan River. Temüjin's disciplined forces, organized into units based on skill rather than family ties, clashed with Jamukha's more traditional but numerically superior army. Though Temüjin fought fiercely, Jamukha's numbers won the day, and the defeat came with a brutal aftermath. Jamukha executed 70 young warriors who had followed Temüjin, an act of savagery that shocked even the hardened steppe. This massacre turned the tide of public opinion. Many began to see Temüjin not just as a capable leader, but as a man who could bring a new order to the chaos of the steppes. By the close of these early years, Temüjin had learned hard truths about loyalty and betrayal, about the value of strong alliances and the danger of misplaced trust. He had begun to shape an army that was different from any the steppe had seen, loyal to its commander, disciplined, and united by more than blood. The road to becoming Genghis Khan was still long, but the first stones had been laid, and the path ahead was marked by the banners of friends, the graves of enemies, and the unbroken will of a man who refused to be ruled by the world into which he was born. The Mongol steppe in the late 12th century was a land of shifting loyalties, fierce rivalries, and sudden, violent reversals of fortune. Tribes rose and fell on the strength of their khans, and alliances could dissolve overnight into blood feuds. It was into this unstable world that Temüjin, still a young man, set his sights on an audacious goal: to unite the Mongol tribes under a single banner. To many, it was a fantasy. The Mongols had never been fully united. Their history was a long tapestry of internal conflict, their leaders too proud and too wary of each other to submit to one man's rule. But Temüjin believed unity was not only possible, it was necessary for survival. To accomplish it, he would have to challenge the most deeply entrenched traditions of the steppe and reimagine what it meant to be a leader. Temüjin's first step was to secure the loyalty of the warriors who had already chosen to follow him. These men, drawn from many different clans, were not bound to him by blood, but by a shared oath of loyalty and the promise of protection. In a society where most leaders favored their own kin, Temüjin did the opposite. He placed men in positions of responsibility based on ability, not lineage. This meritocratic approach was radical and dangerous. It alienated some noble-born Mongols who saw their privileges eroding. But it also drew ambitious warriors from across the steppe who had little to gain under the old system. Temüjin was building not just an army, but a brotherhood. With this growing force, Temüjin began a campaign of persuasion and conquest. approaching some tribes with offers of alliance and others with the promise of annihilation. To the willing, he offered protection, fair treatment, and inclusion in his new military order. To the defiant, he brought swift and decisive violence, making an example of those who resisted. This blend of diplomacy and force became a hallmark of his rise. The tribes he absorbed were reorganized into urban units of 10 men, which were grouped into hundreds and thousands, each commanded by officers appointed for loyalty and skill. This broke the traditional tribal structure, scattering blood relatives across different units and binding warriors to the state rather than to their clans. It was a revolutionary shift in Mongol society, one that gave Temüjin direct control over his forces. Among his key early allies was Togrel, the Khan of the Kurat tribe and an old ally of his father. Togrel provided not just military support, but also political legitimacy, as he was widely respected among the steppe tribes. Another crucial ally was Jamukha, the same boyhood friend who would later become his greatest rival. At this stage, the two worked together, leading combined forces in raids against common enemies such as the Tatars. Their victories brought glory and plunder, and Temüjin's reputation as a capable commander spread quickly. But unity was not built on victories alone. Temüjin understood the psychological game of leadership. When a tribe submitted to him, he made a deliberate show of generosity, sparing those who surrendered and rewarding loyalty with gifts. In the brutal world of the steppe, such clemency was unusual and disarming. He also practiced religious tolerance, allowing his followers to worship their own gods, a policy that would later extend across his empire. These measures, combined with his military discipline, drew more and more tribes into his growing coalition. Still, not all leaders welcomed his rise. As Temüjin's influence spread, the steppe's balance of power began to tilt. Rivals, especially those from powerful aristocratic families, saw in him not a unifier but a usurper who threatened the old order. The fragile alliance with Jamukha would soon fracture, and with it, the Mongol steppe would be plunged into civil war. But for now, Temüjin stood at the threshold of something unprecedented, the beginnings of a unified Mongol nation, bound not by ancient bloodlines but by the will of one man. In the next part, we will follow the decisive break with Jamukha, the bloody confrontations that followed, and the moment when Temüjin's dream of unity would be tested by the very people he sought to lead. The fragile alliance between Temüjin and Jamukha had always been more a truce than a friendship, though they had once been sworn blood brothers, and their visions for the Mongol steppe could not have been more different. Jamukha clung to the aristocratic traditions of the nomadic elite, granting leadership only to those of noble birth. Temüjin, hardened by years of exile and captivity, placed loyalty and skill above ancestry. For a time, their differences were masked by common enemies, but as Temüjin's influence grew, the rift between them widened until it could no longer be bridged. The break came in the year 1187. Temüjin, now commanding a formidable force of some 20,000 warriors drawn from multiple tribes, began to be recognized as a leader in his own right. His followers called him Khan, a title that made him Jamukha's equal, and in the eyes of some, his superior. Jamukha, unwilling to share power, rallied his own forces. His army swelled to 30,000 men, outnumbering Temüjin's by a wide margin. The steppe was too small for two rising Khans. War was inevitable. Their first major confrontation took place on the banks of the Anan River. Temüjin's forces, drilled in his new system of military organization, fought with precision and discipline, their movements coordinated through flags, horns, and messengers on swift horses. But Jamuka's greater numbers began to tell. After a fierce and bloody struggle, Temüjin's army was broken, his warriors forced to scatter across the grasslands. The defeat was crushing, but it was what followed that seared itself into the memory of every Mongol Jamuka. Enraged by what he saw as betrayal, captured 70 of Temüjin's men. Instead of ransoming them, he subjected them to a punishment so brutal it became legend. He executed them by boiling them alive. This act of calculated savagery horrified many on the steppe. In a world where cruelty was common, this was excessive even by nomadic standards. It branded Jamuka not as a strong leader, but as a tyrant. Warriors who might once have supported him began to slip away, drawn instead to Temüjin, whose discipline in war was matched by his measured treatment of the defeated Temüjin. Learned from this disaster, he rebuilt his forces slowly, gathering men from disillusioned tribes, offering them not just plunder, but a place in his new order. He made loyalty to him the highest virtue, and he rewarded it generously. Over the years, he struck alliances with tribes such as the Karat and the Onjarat, married his children into key families, and continued to absorb smaller clans through both diplomacy and force. Each victory swelled his ranks, and each conquest brought him closer to his ultimate goal, the unification of the Mongols. The turning point came in 1201, when a coalition of rival tribes, the Temüjin, the Naiman, and remnants of the Tatars, tried to halt Temüjin's rise. In a series of brilliantly executed campaigns, Temüjin defeated them one by one, using mobility, deception, and psychological warfare to shatter his enemy's will to fight. By 1206, the power of his rivals had been broken. That year, the Mongol tribes gathered at a great Kurultai, a council of the steppe on the banks of the Anan River. Chiefs, generals, and shamans from across the land came to witness what had never been done before, the formal proclamation of a single leader over all the Mongols. In a ceremony steeped in tradition, Temüjin was raised on a white felt carpet and acclaimed as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. This title was more than symbolic. It was a declaration that the Mongols, once a loose collection of warring clans, were now a single nation under one man's command. The Khanate laws, codified as the Yasa, bound them together with rules governing warfare, justice, and loyalty. For the first time in their history, the Mongols were not just a people, but a united power. From the boy abandoned on the steppe to the supreme Khan of a unified Mongol nation, Temüjin's rise was a triumph of vision, discipline, and relentless will. Yet for Genghis Khan, uniting the Mongols was only the beginning. His gaze was already fixed beyond the horizon, where empires far greater than his awaited, and soon they too would feel the thunder of Mongol hooves. When Genghis Khan rose from the Council of 1206 as the undisputed leader of the Mongols, he commanded not just a nation but the most disciplined fighting force the steppe had ever seen. His true genius lay not only in his ability to inspire loyalty, but in his ability to take the raw elements of nomadic warfare, speed, horsemanship, and the bow, and forge them into an organized machine capable of breaking kingdoms. The Mongol army was unlike anything the settled empires had faced. It was not the largest force in the world, but it was the most efficient, the most mobile, and the most disciplined. Every soldier, from the youngest archer to the most seasoned general, was part of a system designed for victory. Before Genghis Khan, Mongol warfare was tribal and chaotic. Armies were loose gatherings of warriors led by their clan chiefs, each fighting in their own style, loyal only to their kin. This meant that in battle, coordination was difficult, discipline was fragile, and personal grudges could dictate strategy. Genghis understood that if he was to project power beyond the steppe, this model had to be dismantled. He replaced the old tribal organization with a decimal system of military units, a structure that was as simple as it was revolutionary. The smallest unit was the arban, 10 men. 10 arban made a zuin, 100 men. 10 zuin formed a mingan. 1,010 mingan made a tumen, a division of 10,000 men. Each unit had a leader appointed directly by Genghis Khan, chosen for loyalty and competence, not noble birth. In one stroke, he had broken the old bonds of kinship and replaced them with a chain of command that answered only to him. This structure was more than administrative, it was psychological. By scattering men from different clans into the same unit, Genghis severed the web of family loyalties that could undermine discipline. Every warrior's brothers-in-arms became his new family, bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. In the chaos of battle, a man fought not just for himself, but for the 9 comrades who depended on him. And because promotions were based on merit, the humblest herder could rise to command thousands if he proved himself in battle. This meritocracy fostered fierce loyalty, not to a clan, but to Genghis Khan personally. Training in the Mongol army was constant and rigorous. Even in peacetime, warriors practiced mounted archery, endurance riding, and formation maneuvers. A Mongol soldier could ride for days without stopping, sleeping in the saddle, sustained by dried meat, fermented mare's milk, and even blood drawn from his own horse in emergencies. Each warrior kept multiple horses, usually 3 to 5, allowing him to switch mounts and maintain relentless speed. This gave the Mongols a mobility unmatched by any other army of the time. A tumen could travel up to 100 miles in a day, striking before the enemy even knew they were coming. Every man was expected to be a master of the composite bow, a weapon that could shoot arrows with lethal force at over 200 yards, even from horseback. The bow's laminated construction of wood, horn, and sinew gave it remarkable power and resilience, able to function in the scorching heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter. Mongol archers carried several types of arrows: heavy armor-piercing shafts for close range, lighter arrows for long range, and whistling arrows used for signaling or to terrify the enemy. In battle, volleys of arrows could be loosed at a gallop, the archer turning and twisting in the saddle with astonishing accuracy. Communication within the army was another of Genghis Khan's innovations. Orders were relayed through a combination of horn blasts, drum beats, and flag signals, allowing massive formations to maneuver with precision. Scouts and messengers, riding the fastest horses, could carry instructions over vast distances, linking units separated by miles of open steppe. Genghis also created an intelligence network within his army, relying on spies to gather information about enemy movements, terrain, and morale long before the first arrow was loosed. But perhaps the most radical aspect of Genghis Khan's military organization was the principle of shared responsibility. If a single warrior deserted his post, the other 9 men in his arban would be punished alongside him. This collective accountability ensured discipline in even the most desperate situations. At the same time, the rewards of victory, loot, captives, and land were distributed according to a strict system overseen by Genghis himself, reducing the kind of infighting that had plagued tribal warbands for generations. By the time his military reforms were complete, Genghis Khan commanded not just an army, but a living organism. It could strike like a swarm of locusts, disappearing into the horizon before an enemy could respond. It could split into smaller forces and operate independently, then regroup at lightning speed. It could endure conditions that would cripple the armies of settled empires. And above all, it was united under one purpose, the will of Genghis Khan. In the next part, we will see how this disciplined force put its training to the test, not in the vast openness of the steppe, but against the walled cities and powerful armies of the Jin dynasty in northern China, where Genghis Khan would unleash the full potential of his war machine. When Genghis Khan forged his army into the most disciplined force on the steppe, he understood that structure alone would not win him an empire. Victory required something far more dangerous, the ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and unnerve his enemies. In this, Genghis was not merely a commander, he was an artist, painting battlefields with deception, speed, and fear. The first major test of this system came against the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin were rich, powerful, and complacent, ruling from fortified cities with walls of stone. They possessed large, well-equipped armies and vast resources. To most nomadic leaders, such fortresses were insurmountable obstacles, but Genghis Khan saw them as puzzles waiting to be solved. Intelligence and preparation before a single arrow was loosed. Genghis Khan gathered information. Scouts rode deep into Jin territory, mapping roads, rivers, and supply depots. Merchants loyal to the Mongols carried reports from within the cities. Prisoners were interrogated not just about troop numbers, but about harvest cycles, trade routes, and local politics. Genghis wanted to know how the Jin thought, what they feared, and where they were weakest. His spies discovered that the Jin armies were strong in numbers, but slow to mobilize, bogged down by bureaucratic chains of command. Their generals often acted independently, protecting their own territories rather than coordinating with the imperial court. Genghis would use this fragmentation against them. Feigned retreat. The masterstroke. One of the Mongols' most famous tactics was the feigned retreat. It was a deadly performance of cowardice. In battle, a unit of Mongol horsemen would deliberately break formation and flee as if panicked. The enemy, believing they had the advantage, would pursue, stretching their lines, exhausting their horses, and breaking their own formation. Then, as if on cue, the retreating Mongols would wheel around, loosing volleys of arrows into the now disorganized enemy. Reinforcements hidden on the flanks would charge, trapping the pursuers in a deadly crossfire against inexperienced or overconfident opponents. This maneuver was devastating. Genghis didn't invent the tactic, steppe warriors had used it for centuries, but he perfected it with timing, discipline, and coordination, encirclement and mobility. Unlike the armies of settled states, which often relied on solid lines and static formations, the Mongols fought like a living wave. They attacked from multiple directions, using their superior speed to surround enemies before they could react. Even when outnumbered, the Mongols could make it seem as though they were everywhere at once. A battle might begin with light cavalry harassing the flanks, firing arrows from a distance to provoke a response. As the enemy shifted to counter heavy cavalry, armored riders armed with lances and sabers would smash into the weakest point. All the while, reserves waited in the wings, ready to exploit any break in the line. Psychological warfare. Genghis Khan understood that the mind was as much a battlefield as the open steppe. Before striking a city, his forces often sent messengers offering terms: surrender and live, resist and face annihilation. Those who accepted were often spared, their populations integrated into the Mongol system. Those who refused were made examples of. In the campaigns against the Jin, entire towns that resisted were destroyed, their ruins left as silent warnings. Refugees fleeing these cities carried tales of Mongol brutality to the next settlement. The stories grew in the telling, walls said to be built from skulls, rivers running red with blood, until fear did half the work of conquest before the Mongols even arrived. This was not mindless cruelty. It was calculated, a weapon as deliberate as the composite bow. Terror undermined morale, broke alliances, and sometimes opened gates without a single battle. Siegecraft adapting to the city walls at first glance. Siege warfare seemed alien to the Mongols, whose entire way of life was built around mobility. But Genghis Khan was a master of adaptation. When facing the fortified Jin cities, he adopted and improved upon siege technologies from conquered peoples. Chinese and Khitan engineers were integrated into his forces, building trebuchets, catapults, and siege towers. These machines could hurl stones, fire, or even barrels of burning pitch over city walls. Sometimes they launched diseased corpses to spread plague inside the walls, an early form of biological warfare. The Mongols also used sappers to dig tunnels beneath fortifications, collapsing them from below when cities resisted for too long. Genghis cut off their supplies, surrounding them completely. He was patient, sometimes besieging a place for months. The mobility of his army allowed him to maintain these sieges while still conducting raids deep into enemy territory, keeping the defenders isolated and demoralized. The Jin collapse begins in 1211. The Mongols launched their full-scale invasion of the Jin Empire. The campaign began with lightning raids across the northern frontier, destroying smaller garrisons and cutting off supply lines. Larger Jin forces that tried to respond found themselves drawn into ambushes, worn down by hit-and-run attacks, and harassed day and night by 1213. Genghis Khan's forces were deep inside Jin territory. The Great Wall, long a symbol of Chinese defense against the steppe, proved useless against an army that could simply ride around its weakest points or bribe the guards at its gates. Mongol forces captured key cities such as Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, forcing the Jin court into a humiliating retreat southward. Each victory brought more defectors to Genghis's side. Jin generals, who saw the futility of resistance and pledged loyalty in exchange for their lives and positions. These men provided not only manpower but valuable local knowledge that accelerated the Mongol advance. The lesson of the Jin campaign. The Mongol victories over the Jin were not just military triumphs. They were proof that Genghis Khan's system could shatter even the mightiest empires. His blend of speed, discipline, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare allowed him to dismantle the Jin piece by piece. And as his armies adapted to siege warfare, he demonstrated that the Mongols were not limited to the steppe. They could conquer cities as easily as they could crush armies in the open field. Yet, for all the destruction he unleashed, Genghis Khan was already thinking beyond the Jin. He saw the wealth of the Khwarezmian Empire to the west, the Silk Road cities rich with trade and tribute, and the possibility of uniting not just the steppe, but the known world, under his rule. Every empire in history has faced the same brutal truth. An army does not move on courage alone. It moves on food, fodder, weapons, and information. Most medieval armies could fight for weeks before hunger, disease, or exhaustion forced them to retreat. Genghis Khan's armies, by contrast, could ride for months, even years, across thousands of miles, fighting multiple campaigns without collapsing under the weight of supply shortages. This was not magic. It was the result of a logistical system that was as innovative as it was ruthless. Mobility as a supply strategy. The core advantage of the Mongol army's logistics was that the army was the supply line. Unlike the lumbering baggage trains of European knights or the heavily fortified supply depots of the Chinese, the Mongols carried everything they needed with them or found it along the way. Every warrior traveled with several remounts, usually 3 to 5 horses, allowing him to rotate mounts and keep them fresh. Herds of spare animals followed the army: cattle for meat, sheep for wool and milk, camels for heavy loads in desert terrain. This mobility meant the Mongols could change course instantly, ride hundreds of miles out of the way to attack a new target, or vanish into the horizon before an enemy could mount a counterattack. An army of 30,000 Mongols could appear almost anywhere without warning, striking where the enemy was weakest. The soldier, as a self-sufficient unit, each Mongol warrior was effectively a self-contained survival system. He carried dried meat boards, hard cheese, fermented mares, milk arag, and a skin of water. In emergencies, a warrior could survive for days on nothing but horse blood, taken by making a small incision in the animal's neck, a wound that healed quickly. Weapons maintenance was also the soldier's responsibility. Bows were kept in protective leather cases to shield them from rain and humidity. Spare strings and arrowheads were carried at all times. A broken bow in battle was not an excuse. It was a failure of discipline. Even in hostile territory, Mongols could sustain themselves by hunting, fishing, and seizing enemy supplies. This minimized dependence on vulnerable long-distance supply chains. The yam, a communication lifeline, perhaps the most revolutionary logistical innovation, was the yam system, an imperial relay network of stations spaced roughly every 25 to 30 miles. At each station, fresh horses and provisions were kept ready. Messengers could ride at breakneck speed from one station to the next, switching mounts without slowing down. This allowed Genghis Khan to send orders across vast distances in days instead of weeks. The same network served as an intelligence highway. Reports from spies, scouts, and allied leaders could reach the Khan quickly, allowing him to adjust strategies in real time. In later years, the yam system became a tool for governance and trade as well, enabling merchants and diplomats to travel safely through the empire. But in the early days, it was the nervous system of the Mongol war machine. Foraging and resource management, the Mongols were masters of living off the land. But it was a controlled and deliberate process, not chaotic plunder. Before moving into new territory, scouts assessed the availability of grazing land, water sources, and potential hunting grounds. The army's movements were timed to seasons, ensuring that pastures were rich when the horses needed them most. When a major campaign began, Genghis Khan divided his forces to avoid stripping any one region bare of resources. One Tumen might advance along a river valley, another through open steppe, each able to sustain itself without starving its neighbors. This spreading out also made it harder for the enemy to target the Mongols' movements. Though the Mongols were nomadic warriors, they adapted quickly to foreign terrains that posed logistical challenges. In mountain campaigns, they used yaks and pack mules. In deserts, camels carried water and supplies. In river crossings, the Mongols dismantled yurts, wrapped them in waterproof hides, and used them as makeshift rafts. For siege campaigns, like those against the Jin dynasty, engineers traveled with the army in mobile workshops, crafting siege engines from local materials. Timber could be cut and shaped on site, while iron fittings were carried in small quantities and reused. This reduced the need for massive, slow-moving supply convoys. The role of conquered peoples, one of Genghis Khan's most pragmatic and ruthless. Logistical strategies was the use of conquered populations. Skilled craftsmen, engineers, and herders were spared from slaughter and integrated into the Mongol war machine. They produced weapons, maintained siege engines, bred horses, and managed herds. In some cases, entire cities were relocated to serve as mobile supply hubs, moving with the army as it advanced. Prisoners of war were often forced to transport goods, dig siege works, or carry equipment into battle zones. Discipline and the law of sharing, a critical element of Mongol logistics, was the strict law governing the distribution of resources. Loot from raids, whether gold, food, or livestock, was collected and redistributed according to a fixed system overseen by Genghis Khan or his appointed officers. This prevented greed from fracturing the army and ensured that no unit was left undersupplied. Hoarding supplies was a serious offense, punished as harshly as desertion. A soldier's loyalty was measured not only in his bravery in battle but in his willingness to share food, water, and horses with his comrades. Why the Mongols could outlast their enemies where most medieval armies could fight a single decisive battle before logistical strain forced them home, the Mongols could fight campaign after campaign without losing momentum. If an enemy tried to retreat into distant strongholds, the Mongols could pursue them indefinitely. If they fled into deserts or mountains, the Mongols followed and survived where others would starve. This ability to remain in the field for years at a time made the Mongols uniquely dangerous. They did not need to go home for the winter or wait for harvests to resupply. Once they began a campaign, they could keep pressure on an enemy until that enemy collapsed entirely. By the time the Jin campaign was in full swing, Genghis Khan had perfected a balance between speed, self-sufficiency, and adaptability. His armies were not only an unstoppable weapon in battle, they were a moving civilization, capable of sustaining themselves far from home and striking deep into enemy territory without warning. The Mongols had mastered the art of movement, and with that mastery, no empire, no matter how fortified or far away, was truly safe. By the early 1220s, the Mongol Empire was no longer a rising force. It was a dominant power stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the gates of northern China. Genghis Khan had broken the Jin dynasty's northern territories and absorbed dozens of rival nomadic tribes into his command. Yet his ambitions were not satisfied. His gaze turned westward, toward the glittering cities of Central Asia. The wealthy heartlands along the Silk Road. At the center of this trade-rich world stood the Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, spanning from Persia in the west to the Sea Darya in the east. It controlled key caravan routes and some of the most prosperous cities in the Islamic world, Samarkand, Bukhara. The empire was rich in silk, spices, precious metals, and, most importantly, positioned between the Mongols and the Middle Eastern markets. Genghis Khan's initial approach to this empire was not one of conquest, but of commerce. A diplomatic beginning in 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan west to the Khwarezmian border. It was a peaceful gesture, an offer to open direct trade between the two empires. The caravan carried fine furs, rare goods from China, and possibly even letters of friendship. It was escorted not by an army but by a small, unthreatening group of merchants and interpreters. For Genghis Khan, this was both economic opportunity and strategic reconnaissance. A peaceful relationship could bring wealth without bloodshed. At the same time, trade envoys were his eyes and ears, gathering intelligence on the markets, roads, and politics of foreign lands. The Otrar incident, a fatal miscalculation. The caravan reached the border city of Otrar, disaster struck. The governor, Inalhuk, a man notorious for his arrogance, accused the Mongol merchants of spying. Whether this was paranoia, political maneuvering, or simply greed, his decision was catastrophic. He seized the entire caravan, executed the merchants, and confiscated their goods. In most cultures of the time, this was an act of war. But Genghis Khan, surprisingly, did not immediately mobilize his armies. He still hoped for diplomacy. In a measured response, he sent 3 envoys to Shah Muhammad II, demanding justice, punish the governor, return the stolen goods, and restore safe trade. What happened next shattered any hope of peace. The Shah blunder. Instead of apologizing or negotiating, the Shah made a decision that would define the fate of his empire. He had one of Genghis Khan's envoys executed and sent the other 2 back alive, but mutilated their beards and hair shaved off, a deliberate insult in the Islamic and Mongol worlds alike. This was not just a political misstep, it was a personal insult. Among steppe cultures, envoys were sacred. Harming them was an unpardonable act. The Shah's message was clear. He did not fear the Mongols, and he would not be dictated to by a nomadic warlord. The Shah may have believed distance and terrain protected him. The Mongols were thousands of miles away, separated by deserts and mountain ranges. He underestimated both Genghis Khan's reach and his capacity for vengeance. The Khan's decision when word of the Shah's insult reached Genghis Khan, his rage was legendary. The Mongols valued loyalty and honor above all. This was not merely a breach of trade, but a public humiliation. Genghis swore that the Khwarezmian Empire would be destroyed, not defeated in battle, but erased as a political entity. This was no impulsive act of revenge. The Khan began one of the most meticulously planned military campaigns in history. He summoned his generals, recalled armies from the east, and prepared to march a force thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and hostile territories. Every detail was calculated, water sources mapped, supply lines organized, and multiple invasion routes coordinated. The march to the west in the spring of 1219. Genghis Khan set his plan into motion. Estimates vary, but his invasion force may have numbered around 100,000 men, not large by medieval standards, but every one of them a veteran of years of conquest. The army was divided into multiple columns, each taking different routes through Central Asia. The speed of this advance was astonishing. The Mongols moved through the steppes of Kazakhstan like a storm front, seizing or bypassing small towns without slowing their march. Entire regions surrendered without resistance. Terrified by the Mongols' reputation, Genghis's strategy was simple but devastating. Strike so fast and so deep that the enemy could not gather its full strength, then crush each isolated city in turn. The Shah's fatal, overconfident Shah Muhammad II still did not believe the Mongols could truly threaten his empire. His forces were spread out across a vast territory, with large garrisons in fortified cities. Instead of consolidating his armies to meet Genghis in open battle, where numbers might have given him an advantage, the Shah tried to defend every city at once. This played directly into Genghis Khan's hands. The Mongols excelled at destroying isolated forces, and fortified cities that refused to surrender became death traps. Worse, the Shah's own generals were divided and distrustful of one another. Just as Genghis's spies had reported, the stage is set by late 1219. The Mongols were deep inside Khwarezmian territory. The Shah's inability to respond decisively meant the empire's great cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench, now lay vulnerable. The Mongol war machine, sharpened by years of campaigns in China and the steppe, was about to unleash one of the most devastating invasions in medieval history. What began as a diplomatic mission had transformed into a total war, fueled by insult, betrayal, and the unshakable resolve of Genghis Khan. In early 1220, the Khwarezmian Empire's pride and jewel Bukhara lay in the path of the Mongol advance. A city of ancient history, Bukhara was famed for its turquoise-domed mosques, bustling bazaars, and scholarly prestige. It was a center of Islamic learning, with madrasas drawing students from across the Muslim world. In the minds of the Khwarezmians, it was untouchable, heavily fortified, well garrisoned, and far from the Mongols' supposed heartland. The people of Bukhara still believed the Shah would ride to their defense. They were wrong. Shah Muhammad, too, instead of confronting the Mongols directly, had fled westward, abandoning his eastern territories to their fate. The approaching Genghis Khan's army approached Bukhara with calculated precision. His forces did not simply appear at the gates. They arrived through an audacious maneuver that remains one of the most daring feats in medieval military history. Instead of advancing along the main caravan roads, the Mongols crossed the Kizil Desert, a desolate expanse of sand, wind, and scarce water. Local guides were coerced into revealing hidden wells, and the army moved in small, staggered columns to avoid exhausting grazing grounds. This route was considered impassable for a force of tens of thousands, which is exactly why Genghis chose it. The defenders of Bukhara had prepared for an attack from the east. The Mongols arrived from the south and west, where the city's defenses were weaker. Shock and isolation. The defenders of Bukhara numbered perhaps 20,000, a mix of Khwarezmian troops and armed townspeople. But they were quickly demoralized. The Mongols surrounded the city before the garrison could coordinate with neighboring forces. Swift cavalry detachments fanned out to intercept messengers and prevent reinforcements. The Mongols' reputation did much of the work before the siege. Engines even rolled forward. Refugees from smaller towns poured into Bukhara, with tales of entire populations massacred, rivers clogged with bodies, and cities reduced to ash. Fear spread faster than the Mongol cavalry that the fall of the citadel. Bukhara's main defense was its citadel, a massive fortress within the city walls. The outer districts fell quickly, as the Mongols combined siege engines, possibly Chinese-style trebuchets, with their trademark swarming cavalry assaults. Once the Mongols breached the outer walls, the defenders retreated into the citadel. The siege engines were brought closer, hurling stones and fire into the stronghold. The defenders' morale collapsed when it became clear no relief army was coming. After a short but intense bombardment, the citadel fell. Many defenders were killed in the fighting. Others were captured for grim purposes. Genghis Khan's entrance, what followed, became one of the most famous scenes in Mongol history. Genghis Khan entered Bukhara on horseback, not as a looter in chaos, but as a ruler making a statement. According to chroniclers, especially the Persian historian Juvayni, Genghis rode directly to the city's grand mosque. There, he addressed the trembling survivors with a chilling message. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether or not these exact words were spoken, the moment was symbolic. Genghis presented himself not as a mere conqueror, but as a divinely ordained force, a scourge sent to cleanse corruption. The looting and the atrocity after the surrender. Bukhara was systematically looted. The Mongols were disciplined in their plunder. Wealth was collected centrally. catalogued, and redistributed according to rank. Artisans and scholars with useful skills were spared and sent east to serve the empire. The soldiers, however, showed no mercy to those deemed useless for the Mongol cause. Large portions of the population were enslaved or massacred. Contemporary accounts claim tens of thousands were killed, though numbers are difficult to verify. What is certain is that Bukhara, once a thriving cultural hub, was left broken and stripped of its wealth. The strategic impact, the fall of Bukhara, sent shockwaves through Central Asia. The city had been considered one of the strongest in the Khwarezmian realm. Its rapid defeats shattered the morale of other urban centers. Many cities surrendered without resistance in the months that followed, hoping to avoid Bukhara's fate, a hope that was often in vain. For Genghis Khan, the victory was not just military but psychological. He had shown that no city, no matter how prestigious or fortified, was beyond his reach. The Shah's inability to defend such a jewel of his empire further undermined his authority. The march towards securing Bukhara, the Mongols did not linger. Genghis Khan knew that momentum was his greatest weapon. His forces moved swiftly towards Samarkand, the crown jewel of the Silk Road, where the largest Khwarezmian garrison awaited. There, the campaign would escalate into one of the most decisive and bloody sieges of the medieval era. The road west was now open, and the Khwarezmian Empire's collapse had begun. By the spring of 1220, the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire had moved from a campaign of retribution to an unstoppable tidal wave. With Bukhara in ashes and its population scattered or enslaved, the Mongols turned their full attention to Samarkand, the glittering capital of Transoxiana, the economic and military heart of the Shah's eastern territories. Samarkand was not just another city, it was a symbol. Situated at the crossroads of the Silk Road, it had grown wealthy. From centuries of trade, minarets and domes gleamed in the sunlight, its madrasas teemed with scholars, and its bazaars overflowed with goods from China, India, Persia, and Byzantium. For Genghis Khan, taking Samarkand would not only cripple the Khwarezmian military, it would send an unmistakable message to every power along the Silk Road: resist, and you will be annihilated. The defenses of Samarkand city were surrounded by double walls, reinforced with towers, and stocked with provisions for a long siege. It also boasted a garrison of around 40,000 soldiers. According to Persian chroniclers, many of them highly trained Khwarezmian troops. In addition to these, there were reportedly 20,000 volunteer militia drawn from the city's population, as well as several hundred war elephants imported from India, each armored and fitted with archery platforms. The commander in charge was Timur Malik, a loyal and capable officer of the Shah. He had strict orders: hold Samarkand at all costs. The Mongol approached Genghis Khan advanced with a main army that may have numbered around 50,000 men, but his forces were far more than they appeared. Days before the siege, Jeb and Subutai, two of the Khan's most brilliant generals, had been raiding deep into Khwarezmian territory, capturing towns, cutting supply lines, and spreading false rumors that massive reinforcements were arriving. This psychological warfare ensured that panic began to grip Samarkand even before the Mongols were at the gates. When the Mongols finally appeared on the horizon, they did not simply surround the city, they sealed it completely, cutting off every road and ensuring no messengers could escape to summon aid. Treachery from within even with its formidable defenses. Samarkand's fate was doomed by a fatal internal flaw: division among its defenders. Many of the 40,000 soldiers were not native Khwarezmians, but Turkic mercenaries conscripted into the Shah's service. These men had no deep loyalty to the Shah or his cause, and they knew of the Mongols' fearsome reputation for rewarding surrender. Genghis Khan exploited this ruthlessly. Before launching his full assault, he sent envoys to the Turkic contingent, promising that if they surrendered, their lives would be spared, and they could even join the Mongol ranks. Within days, half the garrison defected, abandoning the walls and riding out to join the enemy. This betrayal shattered the morale of the remaining defenders. Timur Malik now commanded barely half the original garrison, and many of his remaining soldiers were militia with little combat experience. The siege begins. The Mongols wasted no time. Siege engineers, many of them Chinese and Persian captives from previous campaigns, began assembling catapults, mangonels, and siege towers. Under cover of night, teams advanced to within arrow range, setting up wooden palisades to protect the engines. Mongol archers, masters of mounted and foot archery alike, kept constant pressure on the walls, preventing repairs and exhausting the defenders. Then came the psychological strikes. The Mongols would catapult captured prisoners, alive or dead, over the walls, spreading terror and disease. They also launched flaming projectiles into the markets and residential districts, setting parts of the city ablaze. The elephant's last charge in a desperate attempt to break the siege, Timur Malik ordered a sortie. The gates opened, and the war elephants, massive, armored beasts carrying archers, charged the Mongol lines. At first, the elephants drove the Mongol cavalry back, but the retreat was deliberate. Once the elephants were in the open, Mongol archers unleashed a storm of arrows at their eyes and trunks, the most vulnerable spots. Panicked and wounded, the elephants turned on their own troops, trampling Khwarezmian soldiers and causing chaos in the ranks. The sortie collapsed, and the remaining elephants were captured or killed, breaching the walls after days of bombardment. A section of Samarkand's outer wall finally crumbled. Mongol storming parties rushed the breach, cutting down defenders and forcing them back to the inner wall. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat with swords, spears, and axes, while arrows rained down from both sides. By the end of the day, the Mongols had secured part of the outer city. The defenders fell back to the citadel, the final refuge for Timur Malik and his surviving men. The end of resistance, the siege of the citadel, lasted only a few days. Food and water ran out, and with no hope of relief, many defenders surrendered. Timur Malik, however, refused to be taken alive. According to legend, he fought his way to the river, mounted a small boat, and continued to harass the Mongols from the water until he was finally killed. A final act of defiance that became part of local folklore. The aftermath, as with Bukhara Genghis Khan, showed no mercy. Skilled artisans and young women were taken captive and sent east. Soldiers and officials were executed. Chroniclers claim that tens of thousands of civilians were massacred. A warning to any city that might consider resisting Samarkand's fall was more than a victory. It was the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire's eastern military backbone. With its two greatest cities gone in rapid succession, the empire was now a carcass waiting to be devoured. With Samarkand crushed and Bukhara lying in ruin, Genghis Khan turned his gaze northwest, toward the richest and most stubborn city in the Khwarezmian realm, Urgench. Urgench, known in medieval sources as Gurganj, was not just another provincial stronghold, it was the jewel of Khwarezm's western territories, rivaling Baghdad in wealth and prestige. Situated near the Amudarya River, it controlled lucrative trade routes and commanded vast agricultural lands fed by elaborate irrigation canals. Its wealth was legendary, but so too was its pride. This would not be an easy conquest. The Shah on the run while Urgench prepared for the Mongol arrival. Shah Muhammad II had long since abandoned his people. The rapid Mongol advance had stunned him. But rather than rally his armies for a decisive defense, he had chosen flight. His escape was a tale of desperation. Pursued relentlessly by Mongol detachments under Jib and Subutai, the Shah fled from one fortress to another, always moving westward. These two Mongol generals did not attempt to besiege the Shah's positions. Instead, they practiced what modern commanders would call deep pursuit operations, hounding their target, cutting off his supplies, and ensuring he could never regroup an army. The Shah crossed into Persia, then toward the Caspian Sea, always just days ahead of his pursuers. The Mongols' psychological warfare had worked too well. Their speed and relentlessness convinced him that nowhere was safe. By the winter of 1220, Muhammad II had retreated to a small island in the Caspian, where, isolated and broken in spirit, he fell gravely ill. The once-proud ruler who had boasted of his empire's strength now died in obscurity. His body left to be buried in haste. The Mongols had not just destroyed his armies, they had destroyed his will to fight. The strategic importance of Urgench with the Shah dead, power fell nominally to his son Jalal ad-Din Mingbornu, a capable but young commander. Yet Jalal ad-Din could not defend the entire empire, and Urgench became a focal point of resistance. Unlike Bukhara or Samarkand, Urgench was built on marshy ground crisscrossed by canals, making it difficult for Mongol cavalry to maneuver effectively. The Mongols excelled in open field combat, but Urgench's terrain blunted their greatest advantage. This would be one of the bloodiest and most grueling sieges of Genghis Khan's career. The siege begins in late 1220. Genghis Khan sent his son Tolui with a large force to begin the siege. The defenders of Urgench numbered perhaps 50,000 hardened soldiers, militia, and armed citizens determined not to suffer the fate of Bukhara. From the start, progress was slow. Siege engines had to be dragged through muddy terrain, and cavalry units were forced to dismount to fight in close quarters. The canals and marshes provided natural barriers, forcing the Mongols into narrow approaches that the defenders exploited with archery, stones, and boiling water. The battle dragged on for weeks, then months, with neither side yielding. Winter set in, and the cold only added to the misery. The bloody breach, finally. The Mongols managed to breach sections of the wall. What followed was not an orderly capture, but an urban bloodbath. Street-to-street fighting raged for days, with defenders barricading alleys and using rooftops to rain arrows and stones down on the invaders. The Mongols, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, resorted to setting entire districts ablaze. The city's famed markets, once filled with silks, spices, and gold, were reduced to charred ruins. The aftermath, a massacre without equal, when Urgench finally fell. Genghis Khan ordered one of the largest massacres of the medieval era. Chroniclers differ on the numbers, but some Islamic historians claim up to 1 million people were killed, likely an exaggeration. Yet even conservative estimates place the dead in the hundreds of thousands. The survivors were either enslaved or forcibly relocated. Skilled artisans were sent east to serve the Mongol Empire. The rest were executed to prevent the city from ever rising again. Urgench itself was left a gutted corpse, its irrigation canals destroyed, its population erased. The empire shattered. With Urgench gone, there was no central Khwarezmian authority left in Transoxiana. Jalal ad-Din fled west, trying to regroup in Persia and the Caucasus, but the Mongol momentum was unstoppable. The destruction of these three great cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench, was more than military conquest. It was deliberate annihilation, designed to terrify the Islamic world and secure Mongol dominance over the Silk Road. Genghis Khan had not only avenged the insult of the murdered caravan, he had reduced one of the most powerful empires of the Muslim world to ashes in less than 2 years. The Khwarezmian Empire lay in ruins. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, each had fallen in a storm of fire, steel, and slaughter. Shah Muhammad II was dead, perishing on a lonely Caspian island, a fugitive from the empire he once ruled. Yet one figure remained to challenge the Mongol tide, the Shah's son, Jalal ad-Din Mingbanu, a prince with nothing left to lose. Jalal ad-Din was young, perhaps in his late 20s, but already battle-tested. Unlike his father, he possessed both courage and strategic skill. He had been one of the few Khwarezmian commanders to win victories against the Mongols in small-scale engagements, using speed and surprise to inflict real damage before retreating. But courage was not enough to save an empire shattered beyond repair. By the time Jalal ad-Din took command, the Khwarezmian realm was no longer an empire at all. It was a scattering of isolated garrisons, rebel towns, and terrified refugees. He had no hope of retaking the lost cities. What he sought instead was survival, to gather what forces he could, find refuge, and perhaps one day strike back. Gathering the remnants, Jalal ad-Din began his journey in western Persia, rallying survivors of his father's armies and attracting warriors who refused to surrender to Mongol rule. Among his followers were Turkish mercenaries, Persian nobles, Afghan tribesmen, and even some disaffected steppe warriors who had served under the Mongols and deserted. He gathered perhaps 30,000 soldiers in all, a force far smaller than the Mongol armies but hardened by desperation. With this army, Jalal ad-Din fought a series of running battles through northern Iran and into Afghanistan, striking at Mongol detachments and avoiding open confrontation with the main force. Genghis Khan takes notice. For Genghis Khan, Jalal ad-Din was more than a nuisance. He was a potential rallying point for resistance in the Islamic world. The Khan understood that so long as this young commander lived and fought, he could inspire revolts in conquered territories. Thus, Genghis Khan resolved to personally lead a pursuit. He dispatched some of his best generals, and soon followed them himself, driving south and east through the mountain passes into Afghanistan. The Mongol speed was as relentless as ever. Jalal ad-Din was forced into a retreat deeper and deeper into the mountains, until he crossed into the Punjab region of northern India. The road to the Indus. By late 1221, Jalal ad-Din found himself cornered. The Mongols had cut off his western and northern escape routes, while the Himalayas loomed to the east. The only way forward was south, toward the Indus River, a massive waterway that marked the frontier between the Khwarezmian world and the Delhi Sultanate. If Jalal ad-Din could cross the river, he might find sanctuary in Delhi, where Sultan Iltutmish ruled a powerful Muslim kingdom. But the Mongols were closing in. The final stand. Jalal ad-Din reached the banks of the Indus, near the town of Parwan, with his army and a vast train of refugees, families, merchants, craftsmen, and nobles who had fled the Mongol advance. Behind him, dust clouds rose on the horizon, Genghis Khan's vanguard. Knowing that the river crossing would take hours, perhaps a full day, Jalal ad-Din made a decision. He would hold the Mongols here, on the open ground before the river, buying time for his people to escape. He positioned his troops with the Indus at their backs, a dangerous choice, but one that would force his men to fight without the possibility of retreat. His cavalry formed the wings, with infantry and archers in the center. The battle erupts. The Mongol army under Genghis Khan himself arrived in the early morning. Chroniclers claim the Mongols numbered around 30,000, though their skill and discipline made them the deadliest army in the world. The fighting began with an exchange of arrows. The Mongols, masters of mounted archery, tried to lure the Khwarezmian cavalry into breaking formation, but Jalal ad-Din had drilled his men to hold their ground. When the Mongols feigned retreat, Jalal ad-Din countered by sending only light cavalry to harass them, keeping his main force intact. Then came the Mongol flanking maneuvers. Genghis Khan's cavalry tried to sweep around Jalal ad-Din's wings to encircle him, but the Khwarezmian cavalry fought fiercely, refusing to give ground. At one point, the Mongols broke into the center, threatening to split the Khwarezmian army in two. Jalal ad-Din himself rode into the thick of the fighting, rallying his men and personally leading charges that pushed the Mongols back. The collapse for hours. The battle hung in the balance, a rare thing against the Mongols. But numbers, skill, and endurance began to tell. One Khwarezmian wing finally broke under the pressure of repeated Mongol attacks. The breach allowed Genghis Khan's cavalry to pour through, attacking the Khwarezmian rear and driving them toward the river. What followed was slaughter. Many soldiers tried to swim across the Indus in full armor and drowned. Refugees were trampled or cut down. The river ran red, and the banks were littered with bodies. Jalal ad-Din's escape in the chaos. Jalal ad-Din refused to surrender. According to Persian chronicler Juvayni, when he saw the Mongols closing in, he spurred his horse toward the riverbank, still wearing full armor. Without hesitation, he rode straight into the Indus, his warhorse plunging into the swift current. Genghis Khan, watching from the heights above, is said to have admired the young commander's bravery, remarking to his sons, "Such a son should a father have." Jalal ad-Din made it across to the Indian shore and disappeared into the forests. His army was gone, his empire destroyed, but he had survived. Aftermath. The Battle of the Indus was the final act in the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. The Mongols had eliminated every organized resistance and spread their reputation as an unstoppable force to the very borders of India. For the peoples of Central Asia, the message was clear: the Mongol Empire had no rival, and defiance meant annihilation. For Jalal ad-Din, it was not the end, but the beginning of a long, desperate exile, one in which he would fight again, though never with the strength he had once commanded. The Battle of the Indus had ended in disaster. The Khwarezmian army was gone, swallowed by the Mongol onslaught and the deadly waters of the river. The empire of Jalal ad-Din's ancestors existed now only in memory, its cities burned, its people scattered, its rulers dead or fugitives. Yet Jalal ad-Din himself lived. That fact alone made him dangerous in the eyes of Genghis Khan. As long as he drew breath, he was a symbol, proof that the Mongols could be resisted. Arrival in India. When Jalal ad-Din emerged from the jungles along the Indus eastern banks, he entered the realm of the Delhi Sultanate, a powerful and wealthy Muslim state ruled by Sultan Iltutmish from his capital at Delhi. At first glance, India might have seemed the perfect refuge. It was far from the Mongols' main centers of power, protected by mountain ranges and rivers, and had an established Muslim leadership that might sympathize with the plight of a fellow ruler driven from his lands. But the Delhi Sultanate had its own priorities. Iltutmish, ruled over a vast and diverse territory that was often unstable, and the arrival of Jalal ad-Din with a retinue of hardened warriors and displaced nobles was not entirely welcome. To harbor him might provoke the Mongols to cross into India, a risk the Sultan was unwilling to take. A chilly reception. Jalal ad-Din sent envoys to Delhi seeking asylum and military aid, presenting himself as a rightful king in exile, but Iltutmish, cautious and calculating, sent polite refusals. He admired Jalal ad-Din's courage, but would not risk war with Genghis Khan. The Sultan's decision was clear. India would remain neutral, and the Khwarezmian refugees were not to be welcomed as honored guests. This left Jalal ad-Din in a precarious position. With no allies in India, he was effectively stranded in a foreign land, leading a small band of warriors and camp followers. Hunted by Mongols and distrusted by locals, the outlaw king in the Punjab denied official refuge. Jalal ad-Din moved south through the Punjab region, seizing towns and fortresses to supply his men. He clashed with local governors loyal to Delhi, and even raided into territories that were under the Sultanate's control. This was a dangerous gamble. Jalal ad-Din needed resources, but every raid pushed him further into open hostility with the only power strong enough to offer him sanctuary. Some chronicles describe him as turning almost into a warlord, a king without a kingdom, sustaining himself by plunder and force of arms. His band of warriors became a mobile court in exile, attracting adventurers, mercenaries, and other displaced soldiers from across the Islamic world. The Mongols approached India. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan considered pursuing Jalal ad-Din into India, but ultimately decided against a full-scale invasion. The Mongols had extended themselves far from their base in Mongolia, and the Indian climate, geography, and politics made a campaign risky. Instead, the Khan left garrisons in Afghanistan and along the northwestern frontier, confident that without a secure base, Jalal ad-Din's influence would fade. This gave the Khwarezmian prince a slim window of opportunity, but his position in India was deteriorating. Departure from India by 1224 or 1225, Jalal ad-Din realized that his hopes of building a new power base in India were futile. The Delhi Sultanate saw him as a threat, not an ally. His raids had alienated potential supporters, and his supply lines were increasingly stretched. He decided to leave India entirely. Gathering his followers, he crossed back over the Indus into the rugged highlands of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, lands that were in chaos after the Mongol invasions. Here, Jalal ad-Din began a new chapter, not as a fugitive, but as a commander intent on reclaiming territory from both the Mongols and his regional rivals. The return to Persia. Once back in the Iranian plateau, Jalal ad-Din found that the Mongol garrisons were relatively small, designed more to control trade routes and tribute collection than to govern directly. He began a guerrilla-style campaign, striking at isolated outposts and ambushing Mongol patrols. In these years, he achieved some notable successes. His forces recaptured several towns in western Iran, and his reputation as a fearless fighter grew. Local rulers, seeing him as a potential counterweight to Mongol power, began offering him troops and supplies. By the late 1220s, Jalal ad-Din controlled significant territory stretching from the Zagros Mountains to parts of Armenia and eastern Anatolia. His court, once again, had the trappings of a royal court. Banners, coinage, and diplomatic envoys sent to neighboring powers. Clash with the Georgians and Armenians. Jalal ad-Din's expansion soon brought him into conflict with the Kingdom of Georgia, then one of the strongest Christian powers in the Caucasus. In 1225, he invaded Georgia, defeating its forces at the Battle of Garni and sacking Tbilisi, the Georgian capital. His campaign in the Caucasus was brutal, a mix of calculated strategy and ruthless intimidation. He sought to secure the northern approaches to his realm and to send a message to Christian and Muslim alike that he was no mere exile but a ruler to be feared. The Mongols' return, yet Jalal ad-Din's growing power inevitably drew Mongol attention once more. By the early 1230s, the Mongols under Khan, one of Genghis Khan's generals, launched a massive campaign to finish what had been left incomplete at the Indus. This time, the Mongols came with overwhelming force. Jalal ad-Din fought several battles in Armenia and Azerbaijan, but was steadily pushed back. His forces, though brave, could not withstand the disciplined and numerically superior Mongol armies. The end of the Wanderer. By 1231, Jalal ad-Din's territory was collapsing under Mongol pressure. Forced into constant retreat, he became once more a fugitive, a king without a throne. That same year, while moving through the mountains of Diyarbakir in modern-day Turkey, Jalal ad-Din was ambushed, not by Mongols, but by Kurdish bandits. Accounts differ, but most chroniclers agree that the bandits killed him for his armor and possessions, unaware or uncaring that they had slain the last great Khwarezmian ruler with his death. The Khwarezmian dynasty ended as a political force. The Mongols were unchallenged across Persia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Legacy. Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu's story is one of resilience and tragedy. He was a warrior king who fought until the end, refusing to surrender to the greatest conqueror of the age. Though he could not save his father's empire, he earned the respect of even Genghis Khan himself in the Muslim chronicles. He is remembered as a tragic hero, the last defiant flame of a dying empire. In the Mongol histories, he is acknowledged as a worthy foe, one who stood his ground when all others fled. When the dust settled over the smouldering ruins of Khwarezm in 1221, Genghis Khan had achieved something no Central Asian conqueror before him had done. He had utterly destroyed one of the most powerful Islamic empires in existence. But for the Khan, the work was not done. The Khwarezmian Shah was dead. His son Jalal ad-Din fled, and the Mongols had free reign over the Silk Road. Yet Genghis was not content with simple conquest. He wanted intelligence on lands further west, an understanding of the people's armies, and terrain beyond the Caspian Sea. His aim was not merely to raid, but to scout the frontiers of the known world and to terrify it in the process. For this mission, he chose two of his most brilliant commanders, Gib Noyan and Subbatai Bota. The two great generals. Gib Noyan had once been Genghis Khan's enemy, a general of the Jin dynasty. He had wounded the Khan in battle, a crime that usually meant death. Yet when Geb surrendered, Genghis spared him, impressed by his courage and skill. Geb became one of his most trusted generals, known for speed, cunning, and the ability to appear where the enemy least expected him. Subbatai Bota, often called the Valiant, was the Khan's master strategist. He had no aristocratic background. He rose from humble origins through sheer talent and discipline. Subbatai understood logistics, maneuver warfare, and deception better than perhaps any general of his age. Together, these two formed an unstoppable combination. Geb's daring complemented Subbutai's methodical planning, making them the perfect pair for a long-range reconnaissance campaign. The mission. In early 1221, Genghis Khan ordered Geb and Subbatai to lead a force westward through Persia, into the Caucasus, and beyond, an unprecedented journey of thousands of miles through unknown lands. Their goals were simple in outline, but staggering in scope. Hunt down any remnants of the Khwarezmian royal family who might rally resistance. Scout the terrain, fortifications, and political situation in the Caucasus and along the western steppe. Establish contact, through diplomacy or terror, with kingdoms and tribes in the region. Return to Mongolia with detailed knowledge of potential future targets. Through Persia, clearing the rear before they could push into the Caucasus. Jeb and Subutai had to secure their route. They swept through northern Persia, smashing Khwarezmian garrisons and capturing fortresses that might threaten their flanks. Towns that resisted were destroyed without mercy. Those that surrendered were spared, but stripped of resources. This phase of the campaign also served as psychological warfare. News of the Mongols' approach spread far ahead of them, carried by refugees and merchants, often exaggerated into tales of supernatural speed and invincibility. Into the Caucasus, first contact by late 1221, the Mongols entered the Caucasus region, a mountainous crossroads between Persia, the Black Sea, and the Caspian. This was a land of complex politics and ancient rivalries. The most powerful Christian state in the region was the Kingdom of Georgia, ruled by Queen Rusodan, sister of the recently deceased King George IV. Georgia had been a rising power for decades, expanding at the expense of both Muslim neighbors and nomadic tribes. The Mongols sent envoys to the Georgian court, demanding submission. The message was straightforward: acknowledge Genghis Khan's authority, pay tribute, and you will be spared. The Georgians refused. The Battle of the Caucasus passes in early 1222. The Mongols met the Georgian army near the Caucasus mountain passes. The Georgians, supported by some local Muslim allies, fielded heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry, formidable by regional standards. But the Mongols excelled in mobility and coordination, using feigned retreats and sudden flank attacks. Jeb and Subutai lured the Georgian forces into disadvantageous terrain, then cut them to pieces with concentrated arrow fire before moving in for the kill. The battle was a crushing Mongol victory. Georgia's resistance collapsed quickly. Towns along the route were plundered, and many of the surviving Georgian nobles fled into the mountains, facing the Alans and Kipchaks. With Georgia subdued, the Mongols advanced north toward the steppelands of the Alans and Kipchaks. The Alans were fierce mountain warriors from the North Caucasus, known for their skill with both bow and sword. They formed a loose confederation of tribes, and were no strangers to warfare. The Kipchaks, also known as Cumans or Palavsians, were nomadic horsemen who roamed the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Initially, the Alans and Kipchaks formed an alliance to oppose the Mongols. This presented a serious threat. Together, they could match the Mongols in cavalry strength and had the advantage of fighting near their homelands. Divide and conquer here. Subutai's genius for psychological and political warfare shown. The Mongols sent envoys to the Kipchaks with a simple argument: why should you die for the Alans? They are mountain people, not your kin. Leave them, and we will leave you in peace. Tempted by this offer, and mistrustful of the Alans, the Kipchaks broke the alliance and withdrew. The Mongols immediately fell upon the isolated Alans, annihilating them in a swift campaign. Once the Alans were destroyed, the Mongols turned on the Kipchaks, who, too late, realized they had been betrayed. Into the Kipchak steppe. The war against the Kipchaks carried the Mongols deep into the Pontic steppe, bringing them into contact with the westernmost fringes of the nomadic world. Here, the Mongols clashed with vast mounted forces, engaging in running battles across hundreds of miles. The Kipchaks fled westward, seeking allies among the Rus principalities of Kiev and Rus. These Slavic states, divided into rival cities like Kiev, Vladimir, and Chernigov, were wary of nomads but sometimes allied with them against common foes. When the Kipchaks arrived, claiming that an unstoppable new horde had destroyed their lands, the Rus princes agreed to join forces at this point. Jib and Subbutai's campaign was about to escalate into one of the most famous battles in medieval steppe history, the Battle of the Kalka River, where Mongol cunning would outwit an army far larger than their own. When Jib and Subbutai rode into the Kipchak steppe, they had already traveled thousands of miles from their starting point in Mongolia. They had crossed Persia, smashed Georgia, annihilated the Alans, and scattered the Kipchaks. But now, deep in the western steppe, they faced something different, an enemy coalition that was not just nomadic horsemen, but a combination of nomads and settled states. The Kipchak leaders, driven west in desperation, had sought help from the princes of Kiev and Rus, warning them of a new and terrifying enemy from the east. The Rus coalition forms the political landscape of Kiev and Rus in the early 13th century was fractured. The once powerful state, centered on Kiev, had splintered into a patchwork of principalities ruled by rival princes. Each city, Kiev, Vladimir, Suzdal, Chernigov, Smolensk, and others, had its own ruler, and alliances shifted constantly. The Kipchak envoys played upon fear and greed, telling the Rus princes, "These Mongols have burned our cities, taken our flocks, and slaughtered our people. If they are not stopped, they will do the same to you. But if you help us, there will be plunder enough for all." In response, a coalition was formed: Mstislav, the Bold of Galicia-Volhynia; Mstislav III of Kiev; Mstislav of Chernigov. Yes, 3 Mstislavs. Medieval chroniclers had their work cut out for them. Several other Rus princes, with their retinues of heavy cavalry and infantry, a large contingent of Kipchak warriors. Combined force may have numbered 30,000 to 40,000 men, more than double the size of the Mongol army, which was likely between 15,000 to 20,000. Mongol diplomacy. The warning: when Jib and Subbutai learned of the coalition, they sent envoys to the Rus princes. The message was calm, even respectful. "We have no quarrel with you. We came only to punish the Kipchaks, for they broke faith with us. Do not fight us, and we will leave your lands in peace." The Rus princes not only rejected the offer, they violated the diplomatic code of the steppe. They executed the Mongol envoys, a grave insult in Mongol culture. In their world, envoys were considered untouchable, and killing them was an invitation to total war. From that moment, the Mongols fought not only for strategic victory but for revenge. The famed Ritriatsabey and Jib knew they were outnumbered. A direct battle against the full Rus Kipchak force could end in disaster. So they turned to one of the Mongols' favorite tactics, the feigned retreat. The plan was simple: engage the enemy lightly, pretend to break and flee, lure them into a long, exhausting pursuit over many days, lead them to a prepared battlefield where the trap would close. When the Rus Kipchak army advanced, the Mongols skirmished briefly, then began to fall back. The coalition took the bait, believing the enemy was in full flight. The chase began. 9 days across the steppe. The pursuit lasted 9 days, with the Mongols retreating deeper and deeper across the open steppe. The Rus Kipchak army, eager for a decisive victory, followed without pause. But while the Mongols were accustomed to long marches and could sustain their pace, the coalition forces were not. The Rus heavy cavalry lagged behind at times, while the Kipchaks urged them on. Supplies ran low, and communication between the different contingents grew difficult. Most importantly, the army became stretched out, losing its cohesion. The princes were not marching in a disciplined column. Instead, their forces were scattered over miles, making coordination nearly impossible. The Kalka River on May 31st, 1223. The Mongols reached the banks of the Kalka River, somewhere near the Sea of Azov. Here, Gib and Subutai set their trap. The river was shallow, but the surrounding terrain provided excellent ground for ambush. The Mongols crossed quickly and formed up on the far side, giving the impression they were preparing for a desperate last stand. When the vanguard of the Rus' Kipchak army, led by Mstislav the Bold, arrived, they did not wait for the rest of the coalition. Impatient and confident, Mstislav ordered an immediate attack across the river. His Kipchak allies followed, eager to finish the Mongols before the other Rus princes could claim the glory. The trap springs the Mongols fell back in apparent disorder, drawing Mstislav's troops further from the riverbank. Then, suddenly, the retreat stopped. The Mongol lines wheeled around, and horsechers poured arrows into the oncoming enemy. At the same moment, concealed Mongol cavalry swept in from the flanks, striking the attackers from both sides. The Kipchak cavalry, caught off guard, began to break, and Mstislav's men were quickly surrounded. By the time the second wave of the Rus army arrived, the vanguard was already being cut down. Instead of reinforcing the attack, panic spread, and the coalition began to collapse piecemeal. Total defeat. The retreat turned into a rout. The Kipchaks fled first, scattering across the steppe, while the Rus forces tried to fall back toward the river. But the Mongols pressed relentlessly, cutting down anyone who lagged behind. Some of the princes, including Mstislav III of Kiev, attempted to make a stand by fortifying a camp with wagons and defensive works. The Mongols surrounded the position and settled in for a siege. For 3 days, the defenders held out without water or supplies. Finally, the Mongols offered terms: surrender and your lives will be spared. Exhausted, the princes agreed. It was a lie. The Mongols executed the prisoners in a method both cruel and symbolic. They placed the princes under wooden planks and held a victory feast on top of them, slowly crushing them to death without shedding royal blood. Aftermath. The message to Europe: the Battle of the Kalka River was a disaster for the Rus Kipchak coalition. Entire princely retinues were wiped out. Many nobles never returned home. The Mongols, having accomplished their mission, did not press further into Rus territory. Instead, Jeb and Subutai turned south, circling the Caspian Sea and eventually returning to Genghis Khan after a 2-year, 5,000-mile campaign, one of the longest cavalry expeditions in history. The psychological effect was enormous. The princes of Rus now knew the Mongols were not just another nomadic tribe. They were something entirely new, disciplined, strategic, and utterly merciless. The Mongols, for their part, had gained priceless intelligence about the geography, politics, and weaknesses of Eastern Europe. When they returned in force in the late 1230s, they would come with overwhelming numbers and a clear understanding of their enemy. The Battle of the Kalka River was, in a way, Europe's first warning, a whisper of the storm that would soon break across the continent. When the dust of the Kalka River settled, the Mongol army under Gib and Subutai stood victorious. Their enemy, a coalition of Kievan Rus princes and Kipchak nomads, had been utterly smashed. Their mission to scout, raid, and destabilize the western steppe was complete. Yet their campaign had carried them thousands of miles from the Mongolian heartland, and winter was approaching. What followed was one of the most extraordinary return journeys in medieval military history, a trek that would take the Mongols across the Caucasus again, into fresh battles, and through hostile territory where even they could not impose their will without cost. The Mongol situation after Khalkha. After the battle, the Mongols could have pressed further into the Russlands, but that was never their true objective. Their orders from Genghis Khan had been strategic reconnaissance on a continental scale, testing the fighting capabilities of new peoples, mapping their lands, learning their alliances, and sowing fear. Now, with their knowledge gained and their enemies humiliated, the question was how to get home. There were two main routes, north and east across the steppe, but this meant traversing winter grasslands, with few supplies, and potentially encountering fresh enemy coalitions, south around the Caspian Sea, a path that would take them back through the Caucasus, where memory of their earlier passage was still fresh and hostile. Gib and Subutai chose the southern route, reasoning that the steppes in winter would be too barren to feed their horses, and that by retracing their path through the Caucasus, they could punish any tribes that had resisted them before. Trouble in the Caucasus, round 2 months earlier, during their westward march. The Mongols had crossed the Caucasus with difficulty, fighting a coalition of Alans, Kipchaks, Circassians, and other mountain peoples. They had broken that coalition by bribing the Kipchaks to abandon their allies, then destroying the Alans in isolation. But now, after Khalkha, the Mongols faced a different situation. Their enemies knew their tactics, and the betrayal of the Kipchak had not been forgotten. Word of the Khalkha massacre had spread, and vengeance was in the air, as Gib and Subutai tried to pass south through the mountain passes. They met fierce resistance. Local tribes harassed them at every step, using the narrow defiles and high cliffs to launch ambushes. The Mongols were masters of open-field maneuver warfare, but here the terrain stripped away their mobility advantage. The campaign through the Caucasus became a grinding war of attrition. The Mongols burned villages, slaughtered resistors, and took hostages to secure passage. But progress was slow and costly. The Volga Bulgars await after, finally making their way out of the Caucasus. The Mongols turned northeast, aiming to skirt the Caspian Sea and reach the steppes leading home. But this was not empty country, it was the domain of the Volga Bulgars, a powerful trading and military people who controlled the middle Volga River and maintained strong fortifications. The Bulgars had watched the Mongol westward journey with alarm. They knew that if the Mongols returned in strength, their lands could be next, so they prepared an ambush. The Bulgars lured the Mongols into a trap by feigning retreat, leading them into narrow, wooded terrain near the Volga where cavalry movement was restricted. Then, in a sudden strike, they surrounded the Mongol column, attacking from multiple sides with both horsemen and infantry. It was one of the few times in the campaign where the Mongols were decisively beaten. Many of their warriors were cut down. Some sources suggest half the army may have been lost in this encounter. The price of the campaign, the combination of attritional fighting in the Caucasus and the Bulgar ambush, turned the return journey into a survival march. Supplies ran dangerously low, horses died from exhaustion, and wounded men had to be abandoned. The Mongols had entered the west with a force of perhaps 20,000. They may have returned with barely 10,000. Yet even in retreat, Gib and Subutai maintained discipline. Units stayed organized, reconnaissance patrols scouted the route ahead, and prisoners were interrogated for information on potential threats. The return was not a chaotic flight, it was a controlled, deliberate withdrawal across hostile territory. The death of Jebusome chronicles suggest that Jeb one of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals, may have died during this arduous return, possibly from wounds or illness. If true, his loss was enormous. Jeb was a veteran of countless campaigns, from the conquest of northern China to the annihilation of the Khwarezmian Shah's forces. His partnership with Subutai had been one of the most formidable command duos in military history. Subutai's report to Genghis Khan when the survivors finally reached the Mongol heartland in 1224, Subutai, and possibly Jib, if he lived, brought with them not only the spoils of war but intelligence that would shape Mongol strategy for decades. They had learned the military capabilities and weaknesses of the Kipchaks, Alans, Rus, Princes, and Volga Bulgars, the geography of Eastern Europe, including river systems, passes, and choke points, the fractured political landscape that could be exploited when the Mongols returned. Most importantly, they had proven that the Mongol army could operate thousands of miles from its supply bases for 2 years and still return intact. The calm before the storm for the Rus and their neighbors. The Mongols' disappearance into the east might have seemed like the end of a threat. In reality, it was only the beginning. Subutai would return, this time in 1237, at the head of a massive army under Batakhan, and the Mongols would sweep through the same lands they had scouted, crushing the Rus principalities and pushing into Poland and Hungary. The devastation would make the Kalka River look like a mere skirmish. The 1222-1224 campaign of Jib and Subutai was thus not only a feat of endurance and strategy, but the opening act of the Mongol invasion of Europe. By the mid-1220s, Genghis Khan stood at the height of his power. His empire stretched from the Yellow Sea to the Caspian, encompassing vast swaths of China, Central Asia, and the Islamic world. His generals had smashed kingdoms, broken empires, and carried the Mongol name to the edges of Europe. But in 1226, an unexpected spark reignited an old war, one that would draw the great Khan back to the western frontier of China, to a campaign that would be his last. The Tangut, old allies turned foes. The Tangut people ruled the kingdom of Western Shire, a frontier state in northwestern China wedged between the Jin dynasty to the east and the Muslim states of Central Asia to the west. Their capital, Yinchuan, lay in the fertile plains of the Yellow River's upper reaches. When Genghis Khan first rose to power, Western Shire had been among his earliest conquests. In 1209, after a short but fierce campaign, the Tangut submitted, swore loyalty, and agreed to provide troops for Mongol campaigns. In return, they were allowed to keep their king and internal autonomy, paying tribute to the Khan for nearly 2 decades. The Tangut honored their obligations, sending soldiers to fight in the Jin War and in the early Western campaigns. But, as the Mongol army pushed far into Central Asia, the Tangut court grew restless. They saw the Mongols' forces scattered across thousands of miles, with the Khan himself often absent from the east. They began to question whether this alliance, forged in the heat of conquest, still served their interests. The breaking point, the turning point, came during the war against the Khwarezmian Empire, 1219 to 1221. Genghis Khan, needing reinforcements, ordered Western Shire to send troops to join the invasion of Central Asia. The Tangut ruler at the time, Emperor Shanzong, refused. His reasoning was practical but dangerous. The Khwarezm campaign was far away, risky, and offered no immediate benefit to the Tangut. Worse, sending a large portion of his army westward would leave his borders exposed to the Jin dynasty, who still dreamed of reclaiming their lost vassal. Genghis took this as an open act of defiance. In the Mongol worldview, Vassalage was absolute. Refusal to render military aid was tantamount to rebellion. But with the war in the west raging, Genghis postponed retaliation. He had bigger targets in Central Asia. The final insult, by 1225, the Khwarezmian War was over. Geb and Subutai had returned from their reconnaissance in the west, and Genghis was back in Mongolia. It was then that news reached him of an even greater Tangut betrayal. The Tangut ruler, now Emperor Mo, also known as Li Shun, had not only refused to send aid, he had opened secret talks with the Jin dynasty and possibly the Khwarezmian remnants, offering to form an anti-Mongol alliance. Even worse, Tangut forces had attacked Mongol supply lines in the Gansu corridor, striking at caravans and garrisons that linked Mongolia to its western territories. This was more than rebellion. It was treachery. The Khan's decision in the summer of 1226. Genghis Khan resolved to crush Western Shia once and for all. This was not to be a punitive raid, it was to be an extermination campaign, aimed at erasing the Tangut state from the map. He gathered a massive army, drawing troops from across his empire, veteran warriors from the Central Asian campaigns, horsemen from the conquered steppe tribes, Chinese siege engineers, captured from Jin territory, who would help with the fortified cities. Genghis knew this campaign would require both mobility and siegecraft. Western Shia's strength lay in its walled cities, especially Yinchuan, which had repelled invaders before with its formidable defenses and surrounding irrigation ditches. Crossing the Gobi, the Mongol army set out in late 1226, crossing the Gobi Desert in a series of well-planned marches. Genghis's supply network was at its peak. Relay stations, herds of remount horses, and stockpiles of food allowed the army to maintain high speed without starving. But the Khan also understood the psychological war. Before even reaching Tangut territory, his advance scouts began burning villages, slaughtering livestock, and sending refugees streaming toward the cities, carrying tales of the approaching horde. First clashes, the battle at the Yellow River Bender. First major engagement took place near the Yellow River Bend, where a Tangut field army tried to block the Mongol advance. The Tangut deployed heavy cavalry supported by crossbowmen, a combination that had sometimes checked nomadic charges in the past. Genghis responded with a classic feigned retreat. The Mongol vanguard advanced, engaged the Tangut, then deliberately fell back, pretending to break. The Tangut cavalry pursued, only to be enveloped by hidden wings of Mongol horse archers, who encircled them and cut them down with arrows before closing for melee. The battle ended in a slaughter. The survivors fled toward Lingwu, a fortress city guarding the approaches to the Tangut heartland. Fall of Lingwu. Then, bypassing Lingwu, Genghis laid siege to it immediately. His Chinese engineers brought up siege engines, catapults, scaling ladders, and possibly early gunpowder bombs to batter the walls. The Mongols assaulted relentlessly, rotating units so that fresh troops were always at the front. Within weeks, Lingwu fell. Its defenders were massacred, its population enslaved. Genghis was sending a clear message: no Tangut city would be spared. The march into the heartland. By late 1226, the Mongols were deep inside Western Shia. The Tangut countryside was being systematically destroyed, irrigation canals smashed, granaries burned, herds taken or slaughtered. This was not just a war of conquest, but a war of annihilation. The Tangut court was thrown into chaos. Emperor Mo sent desperate appeals for aid to the Jin dynasty and the Song dynasty in the south, but both refused. The Jin were themselves under Mongol pressure, and the Song preferred to let their northern rivals be destroyed. By early 1227, the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia was collapsing. City after city had fallen to the Mongols, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. The once rich plains of the Yellow River's upper reaches had been reduced to smoking ruins. Only one prize remained, Yinchuan, the Tangut capital. For Genghis Khan, this was more than just the last step in a campaign. It was a personal reckoning. The Tangut had defied him twice, first by refusing to aid his Khwarezm campaign, and then by conspiring with his enemies. Now, in the twilight of his life, he intended to wipe them from history. Yinchuan, the last stronghold in Chun, was no ordinary city. It stood on fertile land watered by the irrigation systems of the Yellow River. Its walls were high and thick, built of tamped earth and reinforced over centuries. Around it lay ditches and canals that could be flooded to hinder siege engines. Inside, Emperor Mo prepared for a final stand. The city held well-stocked granaries, thousands of defenders, and the hope that the Mongols might falter in the face of its formidable defenses. The Khan's strategy. Genghis Khan approached Yinchuan with patience. He had no intention of hurling his men into costly frontal assaults, at least not at first. Instead, he used encirclement and devastation. The Mongols built a complete ring around the city, cutting it off from outside help. Villages in the surrounding countryside were burned to deny the defenders any chance of resupply. Raiding parties harassed anyone trying to escape, capturing refugees and sending them back into the city to consume food stores. At the same time, his siege engineers began preparing the tools that would break Yinchuan's walls. Siege engines and psychological warfare. The Mongols had mastered siegecraft during their wars in China and Central Asia. At Yinchuan, they deployed mangonels and traction trebuchets to hurl stones and incendiary bombs. Large crossbows capable of shooting bolts through wooden gates, scaling ladders and siege towers. But the Khan also waged psychological warfare. Prisoners taken from other Tangut cities were paraded before the walls and executed. Messages were shouted to the defenders, promising that surrender would mean death, while resistance would mean extinction. The goal was to break the defenders' spirit before their walls fell. The mysterious incident. It was during this siege that Genghis Khan suffered the injury or illness that would end his life. The historical sources disagree on the cause. The fall from a horse. Some chronicles say the Khan was thrown from his horse while hunting or in battle, sustaining internal injuries. Battle wound. Other accounts claim he was wounded during a skirmish near the city. Illness. Some sources suggest he fell sick, possibly from typhoid or pneumonia. Legendary tale. A later Chinese story claims he was injured when a Tangut princess forced into his tent, concealed a weapon and attacked him, though this is almost certainly folklore. Whatever the cause, the injury did not immediately kill him, but it began a slow decline that lasted through the final months of the siege. Final Mongol assault. By the summer of 1227, the Mongols decided to end it. Siege engines battered breaches in the walls, and massed cavalry assaults stormed through the gaps. The defenders fought fiercely, but they were overwhelmed. When the city fell, Genghis Khan gave orders that there would be no mercy. The population was massacred, the royal family executed, and the Tangut language and culture targeted for destruction. Records, books, and archives were burned. The Mongols even destroyed the intricate irrigation systems that had made the region fertile, an act of deliberate environmental devastation. In effect, Western Xia ceased to exist. The death of the Khan shortly after Yinchuan's fall, in August 1227, Genghis Khan died. The exact location is uncertain. Some say in his camp near the city. Others that he began the journey back to Mongolia, but did not survive it. The secrecy surrounding his death was absolute. To prevent unrest or the emboldening of enemies, his generals concealed the news until the army had safely withdrawn from Tangut territory. His body was taken back to Mongolia for burial, possibly at a secret site on the slopes of Burkhan Khaldan, according to tradition. The funeral procession killed anyone who saw them to maintain secrecy. His tomb's location remains unknown to this day. The aftermath Genghis Khan's death marked the end of an era, but his empire did not crumble. His sons and generals had been trained for decades in both warfare and governance. The succession passed to his third son, Gedai, in accordance with Genghis's wishes. The destruction of Western Shire was total. It remained a wasteland for generations, its people absorbed into other populations, its culture nearly erased from memory. For Genghis Khan, it was the final statement of his absolute authority, a warning to all who would betray him. The death of Genghis Khan in August 1227 was a carefully guarded secret, a strategic act designed to keep the empire from fracturing during the final stages of the Western Shire campaign. For the Mongol elite, the challenge ahead was immense. To maintain unity across a realm stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, and to ensure that the next great Khan would command the same fear and respect as the founder. The secret death when Genghis Khan died, his generals and family faced a delicate problem. Public knowledge of his passing could embolden enemies, the Jin dynasty in the east, the remnants of the Khwarezmian forces in the west, and various subject tribes that had submitted reluctantly. To prevent this, the Mongol leadership kept his death hidden until the army had fully withdrawn from Tangut territory. The body of the great Khan was transported back toward Mongolia under heavy guard. Mongol tradition dictated a burial without monument or marking in a secret place known only to a select few. According to legend, the escort killed anyone they encountered along the way to preserve the secrecy of the route. Some accounts claim he was buried near Burkhan Khaldan, the sacred mountain of his youth. Others suggest an unmarked grave somewhere in the Kurlan River region. The truth remains a mystery, a pre-planned succession. One reason the empire did not immediately descend into chaos was that Genghis Khan had already chosen his successor years earlier. At the Kurultai Assembly of 1223, he had designated his third son, Gedai, as heir to the title of Great Khan. Why Gedai? The decision surprised some contemporaries. Because Genghis's eldest son, Joki, was the natural heir by birth order, followed by the capable and ruthless Chagatai, but both were problematic. Joki had long been suspected by Genghis of not being his true son. Due to the circumstances of Bert's capture and rescue early in Genghis's rise, their relationship was strained, and Joki often kept his distance from court. Chagatai was fiercely loyal to Genghis, but also hot-tempered and openly hostile to Joki. His inflexible personality made him a poor choice to unite the various Mongol factions. Gedai, in contrast, was seen as even-tempered, diplomatic, and pragmatic. While not the most brilliant general, he was respected by his brothers and trusted by his father to hold the empire together. Joki's death and a family rift by the time Genghis died. Joki himself had already passed away in early 1227, possibly from illness, though rumors of poisoning persisted. His death removed one source of succession tension, but left his descendants, particularly his son Batu, with claims to their father's territories in the west. The western lands, known as the Ulus of Joki, would later form the foundation of the Golden Horde. but in 1227, they were still firmly tied to the central Mongol state, holding the empire together after the Tangat campaign ended. The Mongol leadership entered a transitional period. The empire was governed collectively by Genghis Khan's surviving sons, Chagatai, Gedai, and Tolui, until a formal Kurultai could be convened to confirm the new Great Khan. In this arrangement, Tolui, the youngest, served as regent, managing the central heartlands of Mongolia and ensuring military readiness. Chagatai oversaw his own domains in Central Asia but cooperated with the regency. Gedai, though already named heir, waited for the ceremonial confirmation to assume full authority. This was a delicate balance. Any sign of weakness could have triggered revolts among subject peoples or disputes among the Mongol nobility, but Tolui's firm control and the brothers' shared interest in expanding the empire kept the system stable for now. Preparing for the Kurultai of 1229 was no ordinary political gathering. Delegates from across the empire, tribal chiefs, leading generals, and representatives of newly conquered peoples were summoned to Mongolia. The process was as much about ceremony as politics. The succession had to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of all Mongol factions, and the ritual reaffirmation of the Khan's divine mandate under Tengri, the eternal blue sky, was central to that. The coronation of Gedi in 1229, the Kurultai formally elected Gedai as the Great Khan. The ceremony took place in the traditional fashion. He was lifted onto a white felt carpet and raised 3 times toward the sky, symbolizing his recognition by Tengri. Envoys presented gifts from every corner of the empire: Chinese silks, Central Asian horses, Persian weapons, and Russian furs, a tangible reminder of the Khan's far-reaching rule. A grand feast followed, during which the new Khan promised to uphold the laws of the Yasa and continue his father's conquests. Gedai's personality and prioritas. Gedai was markedly different from his father. Where Genghis was a relentless warrior and conqueror, Gedai was a patient administrator and delegator. He had a reputation for generosity, a love of wine, and an ability to reconcile quarrels among his nobles. His main priorities in the first years of his reign were completing the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China, expanding into Europe through continued campaigns in the West, strengthening the empire's administrative systems, including taxation, postal relays, and codified law. The empire's momentum. Genghis Khan had left behind not just an empire, but a well-oiled machine of conquest, disciplined armies, skilled generals, a unified legal system, and a vision of Mongol supremacy. Gedai inherited this momentum, and his reign would see the Mongol Empire grow to its greatest extent. But even at the moment of triumph, subtle fractures were already forming, tensions between branches of the family, the ambitions of powerful generals, and the logistical strain of ruling such a vast and diverse realm. These undercurrents would shape the next phase of Mongol history. Gedai Khan began his reign with a clear mandate: complete the work his father had left unfinished. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled much of northern China since the early 12th century, had already been battered by decades of war. Genghis Khan had struck devastating blows against them in the 1210s, capturing huge swaths of territory and forcing their emperor to move the capital south to Kai. But the Jin were not yet broken, and for the Mongols, their survival was unacceptable. Strategic situation in 1229. By the time Gedai took the throne, the Jin dynasty was a shadow of its former self. Their armies were depleted, their treasury strained, and their subjects resentful of heavy taxation. They had also lost the crucial northern frontier, making them vulnerable to repeated Mongol incursions. But the Jin still held strong defenses, fortified cities along the Yellow River, large populations that could still be levied for war, strategic alliances with the southern Song dynasty, who were wary of Mongol expansion into central China. Gedai knew that crushing the Jin would require not just military power, but careful coordination among the Mongol princes and their Chinese allies. The Mongol war machine under Gedai inherited an army of terrifying efficiency. But he also expanded and reorganized it. Multi-ethnic forces, alongside Mongol core cavalry. He employed Chinese engineers, Khitan and Jurchen defectors, and Turkic auxiliaries from Central Asia. Siege specialization, building on techniques learned from campaigns in China and the Islamic world. Gedai invested heavily in siege engines, mangonels, counterweight, trebuchets, siege towers, and battering rams, logistical networks. He strengthened the Yam postal relay system, which also served as a supply network for moving troops and provisions quickly across vast distances. The campaign begins -1230 in 1230. Gedai personally led a massive campaign into Jin territory, working in concert with his brother Tolui and the veteran general Sabet. The Mongols advanced along multiple fronts. Northern front Gedai's forces moved south from the steppe, crossing the Yellow River at several points. Western front, Subutai led deep raids to disrupt Jin supply lines and scatter their field armies. Central front Tolui spearheaded sieges against key fortified cities, forcing the Jin to spread their defenses thin. The Mongols used winter campaigning, a tactic that gave them an advantage because their horses could graze on the dry grasslands, while enemy supply lines froze. Siege of Fengshan and strategic maneuvering. One of the early major targets was Fengshan, a fortress city guarding the approaches to Kaifeng. The Mongols encircled it, cutting off food and water, and subjected it to continuous bombardment. As famine and disease took hold inside, the defenders attempted breakout assaults, all repelled by Mongol cavalry. But Gedai avoided overcommitting to any single siege if it threatened to slow the overall campaign. When resistance was too stiff, the Mongols would move on, devastating the countryside and isolating cities for later capture. This flexibility kept the Jin constantly off balance. 1231 to 1232. The fall of Byeonjing Kaifeng by 1231. The Mongols had surrounded the Jin capital at Kaifeng, then known as Byeon. The siege was a slow, grinding process. Engineers built earthen ramps and towers to fire over the walls. Incendiary projectiles, including gunpowder-based firebombs, an early Chinese invention, were used to ignite buildings inside the city. Prisoner labor, captured civilians were forced to dig trenches and build siege works under Mongol supervision. The Jin defenders fought fiercely, but food shortages led to starvation and outbreaks of disease. In 1232, Kaifeng surrendered. The Mongols plundered the city but spared a portion of the population, intending to use them as labor in rebuilding and military service. Final Jin resistance and total destruction. Although the capital had fallen, remnants of the Jin court fled south to the city of Kaigyo. The Mongols pursued relentlessly. In early 1234, in coordination with the southern Song who hoped to share in the spoils, the Mongols launched the final assault. Kaigyo was stormed, the last Jin emperor killed, and the dynasty formally extinguished. But for the Mongols, this was a milestone. They now controlled the entirety of northern China, its vast resources, and its sophisticated administrative systems. For the Chinese populace, it marked the end of Jurchen rule and the beginning of direct Mongol dominance in the north. Turning to the west even as the Jin were collapsing, Gedai was already looking beyond China. He entrusted much of the administration of the conquered territories to appointed governors, often skilled non-Mongols like Khitan and Uyghur officials, while his attention shifted toward the west. The western frontier was full of opportunity and danger. The Khwarezmian Empire had been destroyed by Genghis, but its remnants still harassed trade routes. The Mongols' influence in the Caucasus and Persia was growing, but not yet absolute. Europe lay largely untouched, a wealthy, divided, and militarily inexperienced target compared to the steppe veterans the Mongols had faced elsewhere. Gedai tasked Bato, son of Joki, and Subutai with leading a massive western campaign. Their objective would be nothing less than the conquest of Eastern Europe. This decision would lead to one of the most famous episodes in Mongol history, the invasion of Russia, Poland, and Hungary, a campaign that would send shockwaves across the medieval world. When Gedai Khan resolved to expand westward, he was not simply looking for plunder. The Mongol Empire's vision, forged under Genghis Khan, was nothing less than the domination of all the known world. To the Mongols, the lands beyond the Ural Mountains were not the edge of their reach, but the gateway to new conquests. The responsibility for this western thrust fell primarily to Batu Khan, the eldest son of Joki, and the brilliant strategist Subutai, by now a veteran of nearly every major Mongol campaign since the days of Genghis. Together, they would launch one of the most ambitious military operations in medieval history, the invasion of the Russian principalities, followed by a sweep into the heart of Europe, the gathering at the Orkanen the early 1230s. The Mongol leadership convened a great council to plan the campaign. The target list was formidable: subjugate the Volga Bulgars, who controlled important trade routes along the Volga River; conquer the fragmented Russian principalities, including Vladimir Suzdal, Ryazan, Chernigov, and Kiev; push into Hungary and Poland to break European resistance before it could organize. The Kurultai authorized an unprecedented mobilization: tens of thousands of Mongol cavalry, drawn from the Ulus of Joki Chagatai and Gedai, auxiliary forces from conquered peoples, Turkic tribes, Uyghur administrators, Chinese engineers, and even Persian siege specialists, supply and communication units, supported by the expanded Yam postal relay system, ensuring the army could operate thousands of kilometers from Mongolia. The first blow. Volga, Bulgaria, 1236. In the autumn of 1236, the Mongols struck the Volga Bulgars with crushing force. The Bulgars, a Turkic people who had built a prosperous trading state on the Middle Volga, were both a commercial rival and a potential threat to Mongol control of the steppe. Bata and Subutai approached with characteristic Mongol precision. Reconnaissance forces mapped rivers, winter grazing grounds, and fortified positions months in advance. Multiple columns advanced simultaneously, cutting off escape routes and preventing the Bulgars from concentrating their forces. When the main assault came, it was swift and overwhelming. Mongol siege weapons smashed city walls, while cavalry forces encircled and annihilated Bulgar field armies. By winter, the Volga Bulgar state was effectively destroyed, its survivors scattered or incorporated into Mongol-controlled territories. This victory secured the Mongols' rear and opened the road into the Russian lands, the Russian principalities. Before the storm by the early 13th century, the lands we now call Russia were not a single unified state, but a patchwork of rival principalities descended from the old Kievan Rus. Power was divided among dozens of princes, each ruling their own city and surrounding territory. Some of the most important included Vladimir Suzdal, the dominant principality in the northeast, ruled by Grand Prince Yuri II. Ryazan, a smaller but strategically vital principality on the Orka River. Chernigov and Smolensk in the southwest. Influential in regional politics, Novgorod, a wealthy trading republic in the far north, linked to the Hanseatic League. Although these principalities shared cultural and religious ties through Eastern Orthodoxy, they were deeply divided by personal rivalries, succession disputes, and differing alliances. This disunity was exactly what the Mongols exploited. The fall of Ryazan 1237. In the winter of 1237, Batır Khan launched the first wave into Russian territory, targeting Ryazan as the southern gateway. Diplomatic opening. The Mongols sent envoys to Ryazan demanding submission, tribute, and troops. The prince refused, reportedly saying that the people of Ryazan would fight to the death rather than bow to foreign masters. Mongol response. Refusal meant annihilation. The Mongols advanced in multiple columns, cutting off reinforcements from neighboring principalities. The siege of Ryazan was short and brutal. Mongol catapults hurled stones and firepots over the walls. The city was stormed after just a few days, its defenders slaughtered, and its population massacred. Chronicles speak of the earth being soaked with blood and no survivors spared, a deliberate terror tactic to intimidate the rest of Rus. Vladimir Suzdal and the death of Yuri's sons 1238 from Ryazan. Batır moved rapidly north toward Vladimir, the most powerful principality in Rus. In February 1238, the Mongols laid siege to the city. Despite strong fortifications and a determined defense, the outcome was inevitable. Siege engines breached the walls within days. Fires spread rapidly through wooden structures, forcing defenders into the open. The city was taken, looted, and burned. Grand Prince Yuri II was away gathering an army. When he returned and engaged the Mongols at the Battle of the Sit River, his forces were decisively crushed. Yuri himself was killed, his head sent to Batu as a trophy. With the fall of Vladimir, the northeastern Rus heartland lay open to Mongol devastation. The Great Winter Campaign, one of the most remarkable aspects of the Mongol invasion of Russia, was its timing. European armies typically campaigned in spring and summer, avoiding the harsh winters. The Mongols, however, thrived in winter warfare. Frozen rivers became highways for cavalry movement. Snow-covered fields provided clear lines of sight for archers. Enemy supply lines were even more vulnerable, as local harvests had long since been consumed. From late 1237 through early 1238, Mongol columns fanned out across the Russian countryside, burning towns, destroying crops, and systematically eliminating resistance. The attempted conquest of Novgorod after Vladimir, the logical next target was Novgorod. Batır sent a column northward, but the deep forests, marshes, and worsening weather slowed the advance. Additionally, Novgorod's leaders, perhaps sensing the fate of other cities, opted for diplomacy, sending gifts and agreeing to pay tribute. The Mongols accepted, sparing Novgorod from the destruction that had befallen Ryazan and Vladimir. This was a rare exception, but it ensured a steady flow of wealth to the Mongol coffers and avoided unnecessary losses in inhospitable terrain. Aftermath of the first wave. By the spring of 1238, the Russian principalities east and north of the Orka River were shattered. Survivors fled into forests, swamps, or distant lands. Those captured were enslaved and transported across the empire. Bato and Subutai paused to regroup, their armies resting on the steppe while planning the next phase. the conquest of southern Rus and the strategic duel of Kiev. The Mongols had not just conquered territory, they had demonstrated the terrifying consequences of defying them. Russian chronicles would later describe this period as the coming of the godless Tatars, a devastation so great that there was none to bury the dead. By the late 1230s, the Mongol grip on the northeastern Russian principalities was absolute. Towns lay in ruins, fields untended, and the surviving population either enslaved or heavily taxed. Yet for Battor Khan and his master strategist, Subutai, this was only the first stage. The true prize lay farther south, Kiev, the historic and spiritual heart of the Rus. Kiev's capture would not only complete the subjugation of the Russian lands, but also open the road into Central Europe. And unlike the smaller principalities, Kiev still held significant wealth, fortifications, and prestige as the mother of Rus cities. The southern campaign begins in 1239. The Mongols moved south, targeting the Principality of Chernigov first. Chernigov was a strong military power and one of the few cities still able to muster significant forces against the Mongols. The siege, Mongol siege weapons, including Chinese-designed counterweight trebuchets, pounded the city's walls. Archers, on horseback, cut down defenders on the battlements. The fall, once the walls were breached, the Mongols entered with overwhelming force. The city was plundered, and the population either massacred or enslaved. The destruction of Chernigov left Kiev exposed from the northeast, with no powerful allies nearby to provide relief. Diplomacy fails at Kiev. In early 1240, Battor Khan sent envoys to Kiev, offering the same terms he had given other cities: surrender, pay tribute, and recognize Mongol overlordship, or face annihilation. Kiev's leaders, led by Prince Danilo of Galicia-Volhynia, absent at the time but represented by his commander Dmytro, refused. Their defiance was partly inspired by the city's historic prestige and partly by the hope that help might come from Poland or Hungary. This was a fatal miscalculation. The siege of Kiev, November to December 1240. The Mongol army approached Kiev in late autumn. Estimates place their numbers between 40,000 and 60,000, not just Mongol warriors, but also Turkic auxiliaries, Chinese engineers, and siege specialists from across the empire. The city's defenders numbered perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 soldiers, supplemented by armed townsfolk. The siege followed the classic Mongol pattern: encirclement, no one could enter or leave. Siege weapons, continuous bombardment with stones, firepots, and explosive gunpowder mixtures brought from Chinese knowledge. Assault. After weeks of battering, the walls gave way in early December. The final assault was brutal. Mongol cavalry poured through the breaches, cutting down defenders in the streets. Entire neighborhoods were set ablaze. The chronicles speak of the Desiatina church, where many townsfolk sought refuge, collapsing under the weight of those who had fled there. When the fighting ended, Kiev was a blackened ruin. The road opened to Europe with Kiev destroyed. Battor Khan turned west. His next targets were the Kingdom of Hungary and the Duchy of Poland. Not only wealthy states, but potential rallying points for any anti-Mongol coalition. The Polish diversion, the Battle of Legnica, April 1241, in spring 1241. A Mongol detachment under Bidar and Kaidan struck into Poland. Their goal was to prevent Polish forces from marching to aid Hungary. The Polish coalition, Duke Henry II the Pious of Silesia, led a mixed force of Polish knights, Teutonic Order warriors, and Templar knights. The battle at Legnica, the Mongols used feigned retreats to draw the Polish cavalry into a trap, then enveloped them with mounted archers and heavy cavalry. Outcome: the Polish army was annihilated. Duke Henry was killed, his head displayed on a spear outside Legnica to terrify survivors. This victory ensured Hungary would face the Mongols alone. The invasion of Hungary, the Battle of Mohi, April 1241, while Poland burned. The main Mongol force under Bata and Subotai crossed into Hungary. King Belafor had raised a large army, possibly 60,000 men, composed of Hungarian knights, infantry, and foreign mercenaries. The two armies met at the Sajo River, near the village of Mohi. The Mongol plan: Subotai secretly built a pontoon bridge downstream, allowing one wing of the Mongol army to cross undetected. Bata attacked the main Hungarian camp from the front, while Subutai's forces hit from the rear. The Hungarians, trapped between two Mongol forces and the river, were slaughtered in a chaotic retreat. The victory at Mohi was decisive. Hungary lay open to plunder, and Mongol raiding columns swept through as far as Dalmatia and the Adriatic coast. The sudden withdrawal in early 1242. Just as it seemed Europe would be overrun, news arrived from Mongolia. Genghis Khan had died. Mongol tradition required the princes of Genghis Khan's line to return to Mongolia for a Kurultai to choose the next great Khan. Bata reluctantly ordered a withdrawal. The Mongols retreated east, taking with them tens of thousands of captives, enormous amounts of loot, and the knowledge that Europe's defenses were weak and divided. Legacy of the Western Campaign, the 1-2-3-6-1-2-4-1 invasion, was one of the most devastating military campaigns in European history. Entire Russian principalities were reduced to tributary states for centuries. Poland and Hungary lost tens of thousands of warriors. The Mongols demonstrated their unmatched ability to coordinate large-scale, multi-front campaigns across vast distances. And perhaps most importantly, they left the lingering fear that they could return at any moment.